Spend that many sessions on it, but a few more sessions just to clarify some of the basic yesodos. So if you are a farmer during Shemitta, or even if you have your own home garden and you're in Eretz Yisrael, so we know you're not allowed to plant, you're not allowed to plow, you're not allowed to fertilize. You are allowed to harvest in small quantities for your own consumption, and you must let other people do the same. And this is the famous klal that the peiros, the produce of Shemitta, is hefker, and it must be available for everybody. So Lamaisa, there is a very important limitation on the prohibition against agricultural work, and that is, you are allowed to do what is necessary so the fruit will not die, or the tree will not die, meaning to say the following. You are allowed to water plants, because without the water they're going to die. But you only water enough to keep them alive, right? So you don't water to increase the growth, but you can water to prevent the death of plants. And similarly, if you have a fruit tree, you can do whatever work is necessary in order that the fruits on the tree should not die. So it's either the tree dying or the fruits dying. Now, I'm not an expert in agricultural work, and every person would have to ask a shaila, because you could enumerate like 150 different activities, and a Rav would have to review each of them to determine what is called maintenance work and what is called facilitating growth work. You're not allowed to do things that cause a bigger yield or a more fertile yield or a higher quality fruit, but you are allowed to do maintenance work so the tree would not die, or the fruits on the tree would not die. Okay, so that's one thing to keep in mind. And that does mean that if you have an orchard during Shemitta, there is a certain amount of work that you are permitted to do if it is treated as maintenance of the work as opposed to creating better growth and the like. So that's one very important distinction to be aware of. A second point to be aware of is a halacha that is called sapichin. Now the word sapichin literally means things that grow wild, things that grow by themselves. Safiach is actually a word in the Torah. Safichin is the Aramaic form, plural of safiach. Safiach means that which grows by itself. Now under Torah law, safichim, you didn't do anything, it just grew by itself, so I could harvest it in small quantities and I could eat it. But the Chachamim made a gezerah, and this gezerah may sound very, very strange the first time you hear it until you integrate it with other things. The Chachamim said, all safichin are forbidden to eat on Shemitta midrabanan, because what people would do is, people would plant things, and when it grew, they would just say, oh, this grew by itself. So in order that people shouldn't be able to get away with planting and then claiming it grew by itself, the Chachamim said, sapichim are forbidden. Now, wait a second. So how can you eat apples on an apple tree and the like? I mean, so how do you eat any peiros of Shemitta if sapichim are forbidden? So this is the very important rule. Sapichim refers to things that are planted on an annual basis. You plant them every year. So this would include grain and vegetables. So what that means practically, and this will sound very amazing when you first hear it, you're allowed to eat Shemitta fruit. You are not allowed to eat Shemitta grain or vegetables. So the obvious question is, so how do I have bread on Shemitta? Right? We'll talk about that in a moment. But let me just state it again. It is mutter to eat Shemitta fruit, with the laws of Shemitta, not wasting it, the holiness of Shemitta. It is forbidden to eat Shemitta grain or vegetables because of the gezerah of sapichim. Now, the Chazon Ish writes that the gezerah of sapichim only applies if it totally grew during Shemitta. even if it began to grow before Shemitah, even though 99% grew during Shemitah, it is not nichlal in the gezerah of sapichim. Okay. So let's put this all together and let's ask a very simple question. I go across the street, I buy tomatoes, I buy bread, I buy cookies, a lot of stuff, a pasta, a lot of stuff are vegetables, a lot of stuff are grains. This is a Shemitah year. How can I buy vegetables and grains during Shemitah? Isn't there a gezerah called sapichim? By the way, the sapichim that were sapichim during Shemitah, they're going to be usher even after Shemitah. I mean, they're permanently prohibited. So I'm going to mention 6 ways you get food during Shemitah. 6 different ways. Some of the ways are evasions of Shemitah, legitimate evasions. Some of the ways are controversial evasions. And some of the ways are working within the Shemitah system itself. Evasion number 1, I mean, there's nothing wrong with this. Evasion number 1 is what is called Yavol. Yavol is produce. Chul. Chul is an abbreviation. Chutz la'aretz. Right? The laws of Shemitah only apply to the produce of Eretz Yisrael. The produce that comes from other countries is not subject to any Shemitah law. So one particular way of getting food to eat during Shemitah is by exporting food from chutz la'aretz, and that is called yavol chul. Now obviously if something is imported from America or England, obviously that's chul. But where it gets a little controversial, and this is where yavol chul can also be controversial, is there may be portions of the state of Israel that halachically is not within the biblical boundaries of Eretz Yisrael. And technically it's Yavol Chul. And sometimes that's a very big machlokas. The big machlokas in contemporary Shemitah law is the area of Eretz Yisrael that's known as the Arava. The Arava is a part of the Negev. And although the Negev is a desert, but there are areas of the Negev, oases, that are fertile and the like. And there's a huge machlokas if Arava produce is the produce of Eretz Yisrael, or Arava produce is the produce of Chutz la'aretz. Because if the Arava areas are outside of Eretz Yisrael, number 1, the Jewish farmers are allowed to cultivate it. They can do everything. They can do fertilizer, they can do all sorts of things. And there's no gezerah of sapichim, obviously, because if I'm allowed to plant, I'm allowed to eat it. Right? So, interestingly enough, it's the position of the strictest hashgachas, the most charedi hashgachas. They happen to be lenient on this issue. They treat large parts of the Arava as chutz la'aretz, and as a result, the laws of Shemitah do not apply. But you'll notice, I don't know if you shop around and you see various packaged produce, you will sometimes see, it'll have a hashgacha, but it'll say min ha'arava. So that's kind of alerting you that you need to talk to your rabbi, what his psak is regarding that particular area. Eilat is not the Arava per se, but Eilat is an example of a city that many poskim say is not halachically Eretz Yisrael. And in fact, many people paskin that if you live in Eilat, you got to keep 2 days of Yom Tov. In Eilat, you got to keep 2 days of Yom Tov. Now, I would say spiritually, you got to keep 2 days of Yom Tov because Eilat has so much tumah in it that you need 2 days of purification. So spiritually, that's the way it is. But halachically, some treat it as chutz la'aretz gomor. Okay? So the Arava, which is near Eilat actually, is a similar type of controversy. So this is called Yavol Chul. Chul is chutz la'aretz. Produce that comes from chutz la'aretz. If it's really chutz la'aretz, like France, Germany, England, US, for sure there's no Shemitah issue. Controversies are certain designated areas within the state of Israel that halachically might be chutz la'aretz and may have the heter of Yavol Chul. So this is a double heter. This is both a heter on the farmer who's allowed to work the land, and it's a heter on the consumer who doesn't have to worry about sapichim or these other gezeras. Yeah.
How do we know the boundaries of biblical Israel? Where does this come from?
Yeah, so the truth of the matter is, the boundaries of biblical Israel are given in the Chumash itself at the end of Sefer Bamidbar, where Hashem says, these are the boundaries of the land. So we actually are given the boundaries of the land, but the problem, once again, is interpretation, meaning how do you interpret those various areas. Now, I should add, there's another complication, and that is, the biblical boundaries are not necessarily enough. We also have to look at the more limited boundaries that were settled in the time of Ezra at the beginning of the Second Temple. Meaning, the territory that Yehoshua conquered is actually larger than the territory that was resettled at the time of the Second Temple. And the full Shemitta laws only apply to the limited boundaries of the second Beis Hamikdash. So that's even more difficult to decipher. So you really have a double issue. What's within the biblical boundaries and what is within the boundaries of what is called Kedusha Shniya, the second sanctification, which was in the days of Ezra and the like. So again, these are issues, and again, if you rely on hashgachos, you can rely on their psak on that. You don't necessarily have to do your own independent investigation, but it's quite a difficult issue. To try to interpret the exact boundaries of Eretz Yisrael. I mean, listen. You can rest assured that where you are right now is in the boundaries of Eretz Yisrael. That's not there are areas that there's no question, but when you're talking about far south, far north, east, etc., it's not so. The boundaries are not always very, very clear, and this will have a big, big nafkamina legabe the laws of Shemitah. Right. So that's category one. Yavul chul. Chul simply means imported from chutz la'aretz. Yeah.
Does this same thing apply with Jewishly controlled areas, or versus not like Lebanon or something, or Gaza or wherever might not be Jewishly controlled but still part of biblical Israel?
Well, yeah, it would be the same issue. For example, Eilat is Jewishly controlled, but as I indicated, it's not within the halachic boundaries of Eretz Yisrael. I mean, listen, Borough Park is Jewishly controlled, Lakewood is Jewishly controlled, but we're not going to give that the status of Eretz Yisrael. So something that's not within the boundaries, even if it's Jewishly controlled. In other words, the point to make is the halachic status of Eretz Yisrael is not the same as the legal boundaries of the state of Israel. Now that does mean there are halachic areas outside of the state of Israel that may have the status of Eretz Yisrael, parts of Lebanon, parts of Syria. Even though it's chutz la'aretz, it may have the holiness of Eretz Yisrael. And conversely, there are territories within the legal boundaries of the state of Israel that do not have the halachic status of Eretz Yisrael. So the state of Israel and the Kedusha of Eretz Yisrael, they overlap a lot. I would say 85% overlap. But there's going to be like two concentric circles. Each will have areas that are not within the other. Yeah.
How is it that you have a piece of land that is considered Eretz Israel, and then at the time of Ezra, that gets nullified as Holy Land? How is it that that's the case?
Well, the principle here is that whatever was settled in Ezra's time retains its holiness even when we no longer possess it. In other words, Chazal differentiate between the Kedusha Rishona of Yehoshua and the Kedusha Shniya of Ezra in the following way. Again, I'm oversimplifying, but just to give you the basic principle, the holiness of Yoshua ben Nun's conquest was terminated upon the destruction of the first Beis Hamikdash. The holiness, however, that was established by Ezra remains permanent and inviolate even after the destruction of the second Beis Hamikdash, and therefore Chazal say any areas that were settled by Ezra but remained have their holiness to this very day, but the areas of Yoshua's conquest that were not settled by Ezra technically do not have that status of holiness.
As well, yesterday you did say that a condition of Yovel is that the Jews have to be living in parts of Israel in their tribes.
Yeah,
right?
yeah.
But if at the time of Yeshua, the tribes designated their pieces of land, doesn't that make it more complicated now that certain parts of Israel have been decreed?
Well, I think that would just add to what I said yesterday, that Lamaisa, there's no way we can get Yovel back till Mashiach comes. I mean, you're correct. That would add another factor. Because if there are territories in Lebanon and Syria that in fact were tribal inheritances under Yoshua ben Nun, then by definition, until we have the Jewish tribes settled in those areas, we're not going to be able to bring back Yovel, and even Shemitah would be Drabanan, it would not be Deoraisa under those circumstances. So that's yet another factor. As I say, this is what you might call a halachic subspecialty, so to speak. There are people who write whole svarim on the issue of the boundaries, the Yoshua boundary and the boundary of Ezra, and then you even have another issue. The Chashmonaim themselves, the Maccabees, much later, actually conquered other territories. What's the status of the Maccabean conquests in terms of the halachos of Shemitah and the like? And that's a whole discussion. Do I fold that into Ezra, even though it's not the same time frame? So if it's something you're interested, there are mamish quite a lot of svarim that are devoted to this particular geographical issue. Yeah.
So the fact of the question of whether Eilat is considered part of Israel, that's dependent on the machloket of how where you draw the line.
So really, there are two different questions that are not the same question, but both of them would be a shaila. One is, where do you draw the southern boundary of Eretz Yisrael? Is Eilat in that southern boundary? Is it not? If it's not in the southern boundary, then it's Chutz La'aretz. But there's another question. Even if Eilat is within the southern boundary, was it settled in the time of Ezra? Because if it was not settled in the time of Ezra, it only has Kedusha Rishona. The Kedusha Rishona was Batel with the Churban, right? So these are two different issues, and on both of these issues, there's a lot of discussion, a lot of machlokas. Yeah.
Historical machlokas, is the latter be like the historical machlokas?
Well, ultimately, if you think about it, these are historical machlokas. I mean, you're trying to reconstruct Metzias, but the way it works is, you're trying to reconstruct history by looking at Makoros. So you're looking at Gemaras, you're looking at Rishonim, you're looking at, there were Rishonim who came from Europe in the Middle Ages who traveled through Eretz Yisrael and identified a lot of places. The Kaftir of Perach, etc., Binyamin of Tudela, who was not a posek per se, but he was a traveler. And so you're looking at these travel logs, you're looking at historical documents, you're looking at Makairis and Chazal. There are a number of Yerushalmis. The Yerushalmi actually speaks quite a lot about the geography of the land, but it's very ambiguous. We just don't know, what places they're referring to. The names are different. The names change over time. So the issue of, in fact, what's interesting is they found up north, really an amazing thing, a huge mosaic in the ruins of a synagogue. It was like floor mosaic. Now I think they transported the whole mosaic to the Israel Museum. And this was a mosaic in a shul that literally told you all the different boundaries where you could buy food. They say, you can buy, avocados, only as far as the fifth gate to this thing and that thing. And it really gave all sorts of boundaries in terms of, like imagine, it's like you go to a show and you just have a big notice on the wall that tells you what stores you can go to after Pesach. So this was equivalent. This is like, 1,000 years old. This is before the Mishnah. More than 1,000 years old. Way before the Mishnah even. It's the earliest thing we have. And it actually gives boundaries, and it talks about what food you can buy. When do you have to take off Demai or Truma or Meiser? When is it Shemitah? And that is actually one of the main sources to reconstruct what the boundaries of Ezra were, because really it's describing the boundaries in the second kibush. This is called Ketovet HaRachov. There's a very nice Wikipedia article on it. The inscription of Rachov is the town where they found it, and it really is quite amazing. What's interesting is that it's like 90% consistent with the Yerushalmi. It's like a 10% difference, but it mamish is very, very much the same as what Chazal said in the Yerushalmi, so it's used as a different makor and the like. Right, so that's you called Yevol Chol. So again, the concept is very simple. If it's from Chutz La'aretz, there's no Shemitah issues, but the complications are, how do you define boundaries? That's going to be a big issue. Okay, the second source of Shemitah food is simply called shishis, produce that belongs to the 6th year or earlier. It's not Shemitah produce. Meaning if it's not Shemitah produce, there's no Shemitah laws that govern it. Now here though, I did allude to something. What makes something Shemitah produce? This is a little tricky. Let's differentiate between fruit, vegetables, grain, and each one of them has a different standard as to is it Shemitah or is it not Shemitah. With fruit, I think I mentioned yesterday, what determines whether it's Shemitah is when did the budding occur. Remember, in a fruit tree, fruit trees produce flowers, and in the middle of the flower, there is a bud, and when the bud grows to a certain size, the flower falls off, and now you have a bud, and the bud is the root, so to speak, of the fruit. The fruit grows from the bud. So the bud is only the very beginning, a tiny little bud. But for purposes of Shemitah, when was there budding? B-U-D-D-I-N-G. The Hebrew word is chanata. When was there budding? If the budding was before Shemitah, it is a non-Shemitah fruit, even if it grew 100% or 99% during Shemitah. If, on the other hand, the budding occurred in Shemitah, it is a Shemitah fruit, even after Shemitah, even though it grew 99%. So in order for fruit to be classified as 6th-year fruit, not subject to Shemitah laws, the chanata had to occur before Tishrei. And now you'll notice when you go into bins, you go into stores, you go into across the street, Darzi right? So you'll notice that there'll be a Hebrew thing, they'll have apples, and it'll say shishit, meaning belonging to the 6th year. That's telling you there are no Shemitah laws associated, which means the budding occurred prior to Shemitah, right? Shoshishit. Now, the same is true now for vegetables, however, there's a different standard. Vegetables are assigned to the year they were picked. Picked, harvested, that's called lakita. So fruit is chanata, vegetables are lakita. So let's figure this out. Tomatoes. So tomatoes that were harvested before Shemitah are not Shemitah tomatoes. No problem. But here it gets a little tricky. What about tomatoes that were harvested during Shemitah? Now, either bi'avera, so, you're not supposed to harvest whole quantities, or in small quantities, whatever. We're not looking right now, was there a sin to harvest it? But they were harvested tomatoes. Am I allowed to eat those tomatoes? So, this is going to be a little complicated. If the tomatoes were harvested during Shemitah, they are Shemitah tomatoes. But Shemitah tomatoes can be eaten with the holiness of Shemitah, meaning you don't waste them, etc., unless you have the rabbinic decree of Sapichim. But the Chazon Ish said the rabbinic decree of Sapichim only applies if 100% of its growth occurred during Shemitah. Now, if the only thing that happened was most of it grew before Shemitah, or even if part of it grew before Shemitah, and I harvested it during Shemitah, it is Shemitah tomatoes. And it does have the holiness of Shemitah, but it doesn't have the rabbinic prohibition of Sapichim, so you can eat those tomatoes in what is called the holiness of Shemitah. If, on the other hand, the whole tomato grew during the 7th year, and you harvested it, then not only is it a Shemitah tomato, but it's a tomato you're not even allowed to eat because of Gezeras Sapichim. So when it comes to tomatoes, there are actually, or any vegetable, there are 3 possibilities. One is there are no halachic restrictions at all. That's if it was harvested before Shemitah. It's not a Shemitah tomato. The second is, it is a Shemitah tomato that must be eaten with the holiness of Shemitah, but it doesn't have the Yisr of Sapichim, that would be the tomato began some of its growth before Shemitah, you harvested it during Shemitah. The third is the tomato is absolutely prohibited to eat. That's if the whole thing, meaning the tomato plant was empty, so to speak, at the beginning, and the whole tomato grew during Shemitah. That's nichlal in the gezerah of Sapichim. So according to the Chazon Ish, there's going to be a subtle distinction between vegetables that have Kedusha Shavias without a gezerah of Sapichim versus vegetables that have Kedusha Shavias with a gezerah of Sapichim. Okay. So Yavul Shishis is basically telling you it was harvested before Shemitah, so don't worry about anything. Okay. Now what about grain? What year is grain assigned to? So grain has a third test. So fruit is budding, vegetables is harvesting, grain is assigned to the year that it reached a third of its complete ripening. Meaning, if it would take, for example, 6 months from planting to harvest, so 2 months would be 1/3 of its ripening. So again, we follow the same rule. If it reached 1/3 of its ripening before Shemitah, even if 2/3 was during Shemitah, and it was harvested during Shemitah, it does not have Kedushat Shvi'at, and you can eat it like anything. If it reached 1/3 of its growth during Shemitah, so then it has the holiness of Shemitah, but here's the thing, it'll also have the gezerah of Sapichim, because if the whole growth occurred during Shemitah, you can't eat the grain at all. It's a gezerah of Sapichim. Okay, so remember this, so that when you're dealing with fruit, the fruit is never going to be forbidden to eat. When you're dealing with grains and vegetables, there may sometimes be mamish and isser of eating. That's the gezerah of Sapichim, but the Chazon Ish does teach us that if any of the growth was earlier, for example, even the grain is the same thing. If, let's say, 1/6 of the growth was before Shemitah, and it hit the 1/3 in Shemitah, it has the holiness of Shemitah, but it doesn't have the gezerah of Sapichim. Okay, did everyone keep that subtlety in mind? Yeah.
For Sapichim, this gezerah of Sapichim, is it applicable to Hana as well, or just?
It applies to Hana as well. Okay, alrighty. All right, so I've mentioned Yavul Chol, imported. We mentioned Shishis, which will have a different definition for grain and vegetables and fruit. But generally speaking, when it says Yavul Shishis, commercially, it means the whole thing was harvested before Shemitah, so there's just no issue. You don't have to worry about anything at all. Yeah.
Where does flowers fall into this category? Do flowers have future shvi?
Yeah, so you need hechsherim on flowers. The question is, flowers have certain halachas of kedusha shvius. They're not food products, so but nevertheless, a person who violates the laws of Shemitah, you're not supposed to buy things from someone who violates Shemitah laws, and therefore you need a hechsher that these flowers were not produced by agricultural planting. That's a violation of Shemitah. So the flowers are not peiros shvius. It's a different cheshbon, but they may be the product of forbidden labor.
And so you can't throw them out?
No, so the truth is that's why because they don't have kedusha shvius, you can throw them out. But if they don't have a hashgacha, you're not supposed to buy them because you're supporting people who violate the laws of Shemitah. But they don't have kedusha shvius, so you can throw them out.
So they do need hashgacha.
Yes, but for a different reason. Yeah.
So you said with regards to the vegetable, how much, what fraction needed to be harvested in order for you to use it? What was the fraction you said?
Well, no. In other words, with a vegetable, each vegetable that you harvest, in other words, if I harvest one tomato, so that tomato has the holiness of Shemitah. But the Chazon Ish's point was that for the gezerah of Sapichim, if any part of the tomato was already growing before Shemitah, it will not have the gezerah of Sapichim.
Oh.
You see?
Is that we go by, or?
Oh, yeah. Well, I mean, everything's machlokas, but derech klal, you could certainly rely on the Chazon Ish. Again, let me just point out, in case you're not aware of this, I mean, the Chazon Ish we know him as a great Gadol B'Torah, but the Chazon Ish was really the architect of how religious Jews keep Shemitah in Eretz Yisrael. I mean, he was the one. I mean, he came to Eretz Yisrael in the 1930s, and he studied all of the farming techniques and all of the various things, and he worked out halachic ways of doing this. So modern Shemitah observance in the Haredi world is almost single-handedly the Chazon Ish. Now, I'll talk about the Heter Mechira, which the Chazon Ish didn't told of, and that, we'll get to that. There's a lot of different things, and it's hard to explain one thing without explaining the other. Yeah.
Is someone who buys produce without
Yeah.
a present, without a
Yeah.
extra, is that an issue on the buyer as well?
It is an issur on the buyer, and the reason is because when you buy produce that was produced in violation of the laws of Shemitah, you're giving chizuk, you're giving support to those who commit sin. So let's take a very simple situation. Let's imagine you have a farmer who simply violated Shemitah, didn't sell it to a guy. The farmer simply plows and plants and harvests b'yisr, and he's selling you stuff. So the farmer is over on the isurim of work during Shemitah, whether they're doraisa or drabanan, that's a machlokas. But he's over on those isurim. Now, you might say logically, all right, he's over on these isurim, but what does that have to do with me? I didn't do anything wrong, and this is Shemitah produce. And at least if it's not sapichim, like fruit, I'm allowed to eat Shemitah produce, and I'll keep the holiness of Shemitah. So what is it my business, you would think, what the farmer did, right? Like, who cares if he did a sin or didn't do a sin? How does it affect me? It's a good question. And really, on a doraisa level, it may, even if Shemitah is doraisa, it may not affect you. But the Chachamim say it is prohibited to give economic support to activities that are in contravention to halacha. And therefore, if my money is going to go to a farmer who violated the laws of Shemitah, I am not allowed to buy that produce. And even though I'm not buying it from the farmer, what are you bothering me? I'm not giving support to the farmer. I'm giving support to a retail store. Okay, but we understand that the store will pay the farmer because the store gets money from you, etc. So that's nichlal in mechazek over avera. Now, it could be b'di'evet. If you bought the food, it could very well be you would be allowed to eat it. See, it's a different thing. But you're not allowed to buy. Again, you understand the idea here. This is not an isser achila per se. This is an isser to be mechazek, to strengthen over a avera. So you're definitely not allowed to buy produce that was made in violation of Shemitah. There is a big machlokes, are you allowed to eat the produce once it was bought? The minhag of Yerushalayim actually is to matter. It's interestingly enough, in Bnei Brak they're machmir. But the minhag Yerushalayim is that produce that was produced in violation of Shemitah can be b'di'evet be eaten, but even the minhag Yerushalayim does not allow you to buy it because you're mechazek over a avera. Yeah.
If you eat at someone's house who did that, is that considered supporting, or is that you eating it?
So that's exactly the case. That's a very good point, and this will come up with the Heter Mechira, but let's not even talk about Heter Mechira right now.
Right.
Just to talk about clear violation. So you're 100% correct. The nafkamina would be, could I eat as an invited guest? Meaning, if the only reason I'm not allowed to buy produce in contravention of Shemitah is because I am giving economic support to Ovrei Avera, when I am a guest in someone's home and I am not the one who made the purchase, I would be allowed to eat. So under the minhag of Yerushalayim, that we don't aser bi'etzem, the consumption of produce in violation of Shemitah, you would not be allowed to buy, but you would be allowed to eat, both in terms of b'di'evet if you bought, and in terms of being a guest in somebody's home. Ma she'ein kain, like the Chazon Ish's own psak, which is followed in Bnei Brak, that produce that was produced in contravention of Shemitah becomes treif, then there would be no difference between you're buying it and you're eating it and you're being a guest in somebody's home. It would be totally usher. Okay, so this is a big machlokas. There are going to be a number of areas, this is the first time I think we encountered it, in which Bnei Brak, which is the Chazon Ish's city, and Yerushalayim have different shitas, legabe Shemitta, and the halachic category this falls on, I'll give you the terms, is Shamor v'ne'evad. Shamor means produce that was guarded, that's a violation of Shemitah, meaning you made a gate, and ne'evad, and produce that was cultivated. The shita of the Chazon Ish, Shamor and ne'evad is osur to eat. The minhag Yerushalayim, Shamor v'ne'evad is mutar to eat. But you're not allowed to buy, don't forget that part of it, because you're mechazek yedei ovrei aveira, you are strengthening those who committed sins. But let me point out that when you mamish have sapichim, grains or vegetables that grew totally during Shemitah, there's no machlokas, the Chazon Ish and Yerushalayim. That's the gezerah of the Rabbanan called sapichim. So when there's a gezerah sapichim, you're not going to have any machlokas. For sure you're not allowed to eat, and if you're a guest in somebody's home, you wouldn't be allowed to eat it either. So don't confuse this. The gezerah of sapichim is the gezerah of Chazal. Shamor and Nevad is when you don't have a gezerah of sapichim, either because it's fruit or because part of the grain or vegetable grew before Shemitah, so sapichim is not an issue. But if it was produced in contravention of Shemitah, you have this issue of not supporting ovrei aveira, and the minhag of Bnei Brak is not to eat it at all. Now, politically, maybe politically is not the right word. In recent years, many of the chumras of Bnei Brak have become chumras of many Bnei Torah in Yerushalayim, particularly as Chaim Kanievsky got, he was always very, very great, but as he got more and more famous, more and more makubal as the Gadol Hador, he is, of course, the Chazon Ish's nephew, and all of his hachraos are according to the Chazon Ish. You actually find the Chazon Ish's psakim become more and more mainstream in Yerushalayim as well. Some of the old Yerushalmis are actually not in favor of it. One outstanding example, which has nothing to do with Shemitah, is the use of electricity on Shabbos. You know, the Chazon Ish famously paskins that if you have a power company where most of the workers are Jewish, you are not allowed to use electric lights on Shabbos because you're benefiting from the desecration of Shabbos by Jewish people. And therefore in Bnei Brak, they do not use the regular power grid. If they have lights at all, it is only from a private generator. In other words, they will not use these lights on Shabbos. I'm not talking about turning it on Shabbos. I'm talking about the light is on before Shabbos. They will not use it because they say we're benefiting from power of a Jew. The minhag of Yerushalayim, and really the rest of the world, most of the world, of course, in most of the world it's not a shayla because most of the employees are goyim, but in Eretz Yisrael it was a shayla. The minhag of Yerushalayim was to be mekel on this for various reasons, and that's why in Mir or Sameach, right, all the yeshivas, there are no separate generators, we just use the regular electricity. But what's happened in the past maybe 20 years, 15, 20 years, is many B'nai Torah are now following Rav Chaim Kanievsky's Chazon Ish's psak, and they are investing in generators. Now generators are expensive, so what they do is, like a building, an apartment building, if it's all Haredi or all B'nai Torah, they'll put out whatever, $5,000, they'll divide it among people to buy a generator, so on Shabbos they don't have to benefit from the power company. So that's a famous example of more and more people following the Chazon Ish. I'm not giving you a psak on this, I'm just a reporter right now. And similarly for Shemitah, by the way, the issues are very similar if you think about this. Just like the Chazon Ish says, don't benefit from Jews violating Shabbos, the Chazon Ish says, don't benefit from Jews violating Shemitah. The Chumrah is almost the same Chumrah. And in Bnei Brak, the psak was that any produce that was cultivated in contravention of Shemitah, you are not allowed to eat. even if you're a guest or whatever it is. That was not the minhag of Yerushalayim, but many B'nai Torah follow it, right? So the Chazon Ish's influence is kind of spreading. Rav Chaim was a big spreader of the Chazon Ish's influence. Yeah.
If it is the case that in the minhag of Yerushalayim you can eat food improperly harvested during Shemitta, you can eat it if a guest gives it to you. I mean, if a host gives it to you.
Yeah.
Then does that also mean that Shemitta harvested food is a tray food that doesn't cause kalim to become tray?
In Yerushalayim, that's correct.
Right.
Yeah, that's correct. That's a very good point. That is a very, very good point. Since the minhag Yerushalayim is that this produce is not treif, it's just something you don't buy, but it's not treif, then it would not make your pots and pans treif. You wouldn't have to kosher. Like the Chazon Ish, you're 100% correct. Even, let's assume you follow the minhag Yerushalayim and you eat produce that was produced in violation of Shemitah. And I'm machmer, right? So I tell you, when I go to your house, don't give me any of that stuff. Just give me other stuff. Give me 60er. But that's not going to help me. Because if it's cooked in the same pots as that other stuff, it's like chazer. According to the Chazon Ish, it is chazer. So at that point, you're going to have a whole complication about koshering pots. Meaning it is not so pashut that how a B'nai Brak person could eat in a Yerushalmi's house. A lot of things are going to be treif according to that view. And even after Shemitah, there's going to be a problem, because once it's treif, meaning whatever is forbidden forever. It's not just forbidden for the 7th year. Produce in violation of Shemitah is chazer, and it's chazer in the 8th year, and the 9th year, and the 10th year, and forever and ever. So it's a very good point that you're raising. Yeah.
Just on this topic of kalim with different minhags, if I go to a Taiwanese house and they cook sex, does that mean I can't eat from the
Yeah. So kidneyas is an excellent illustration of that, where for me, I'm an Ashkenazi, I can't eat rice on Pesach. A Sephardi can eat rice on Pesach. So the Sephardi cannot give me rice, but if he gives me potatoes that were cooked in the rice pot, do I treat the pot as treif? That's a machlokas. But l'maisa there, we do have a psak, that since kitnios is only asur as a minhag, it's not really an absolute halacha, so the chumrah does not extend to the pots, and therefore an Ashkenazi can eat non-kitnios food that was prepared in a kitnios pot. What you're saying is a question, but we are making. What about the what?
Temanim still have the...
Oh, it's the locust. Yeah. Temanim eat the locust. Yeah, same thing. Since mi'ikar adin, it is mutter. What is usher only mitam minhag is not going to forbid the kalim. But that's not the same for shamor and navad. According to the Chazon Ish, shamor and navad are forbidden already from Chazal, and therefore it would be treated like something mamish treif. So you can't compare the different cases. Okay, all right. So we'll stop here again. We'll continue tomorrow.